In the late 1800s, the Barnum and Bailey circus tent could accommodate 15,000 spectators, plus hundreds of performers, including people, horses, lions, elephants, camels, and more. A circus might spend up to a third of their entire operating budget on publicity alone, plastering towns with posters prior to the circus's arrival. On the day the circus arrived in town, also known as Circus Day, schools and workplaces would shut down entirely so that employees and pupils could watch the circus enter town and unpack their things. The parade alone was such spectacular advertising that some people mistook it for the entire show. In fact, the traditional American circus was as much a business model as it was an entertainment form, and it all began over 100 years prior to Barnum and Bailey's massive spectacle even hitting the road. The various circus arts were brought under the same roof in 1768 Britain, but it wasn't until 1793 that the Scottish trick horseback rider John Bill Ricketts debuted the form in America. And for the first century or so, the American circus followed the British model. In this version of circus, equestrian displays were central and other performance forms occupied the space between acts. However, by the 1830s, the circus in America began to shift into something distinctly American. In Britain, most circuses operated out of physical, permanent buildings, but in America, the adoption of the canvas circus tent meant that the circus was portable. This meant that they could make more money on a single day of performances, and if the weather got cold, they could just pack up and head south for the winter. In the 1870s, the largest circuses had traded their wagons for trains, and this just made the whole industry bigger, faster, more expensive, and more profitable. Some circus advertisements didn't even feature pictures of the performances, but rather pictures of circus impresarios, which is demonstrative of another aspect of American culture, the hopeful and respectable rags to riches narrative of capitalism. All this to say, the history of American circus is an all-encompassing topic within which to study some of the biggest technological, economic, social, and political issues of today. The traditional circus embodies a lot of challenging contradictions that still animate societal discourse right now. For instance, on the one hand, circus was praised as being accessible and affordable and had general tenets of inclusivity, but on the other hand, its staging reinforced societal hierarchies of race, gender, ability, and species. It also pushed forward America's modernizing efforts by embracing the use of electricity and train travel, even as, over time, it maintained a rather anti-technological aesthetic. And it promoted the education of the public through things like museums, menageries, and sideshows, even as their advertising was filled with humbug to sensationalize their offerings and deceive their audiences. All these complexities make the traditional circus a fascinating but frustrating field to explore. It can be hard to parse out what is true within the historical records of an entertainment form that was more a business than an art. And yet, that need to wade through an ocean of misinformation to figure out what really happened at the circus is exactly the kind of work we need to do to develop a level of critical thinking in our current age of AI-generated content and misinformation. So not only can a study of the traditional circus teach us much about how America was built, but it can also teach us valuable critical thinking skills so we can address contemporary issues. Maybe I'm just not in the right academic circles for it, but I find it remarkable how little we study the modern American circus, considering how massive of an impact it's had on American culture. And I am just as guilty of this as anyone. I feel like I know very little about the circus prior to about the 1970s. But prior to the onset of film and television, the circus was a really big deal, and I would argue still a pretty big deal today in its revamped contemporary version. So where do we start our circus education? Well, in the rest of this video, I'm going to share with you some books that I currently own, some of which I've already read, most of which I haven't yet, and all of which deal with traditional circus in some way so that we can start to learn this history together. The first book I want to show you has been sitting on my coffee table for a long time, an embarrassingly long time, without having been read. And I picked it up the other day and started to read and realized what a mistake it had been to treat this as just another coffee table book. But it is gorgeous, and that book is The American Circus. This is edited by Susan Weber, Kenneth L. Ames, Matthew Whitman, and it's published in 2012. This giant text has 17 chapters on various aspects of the American Circus, including chapters specific to the circus parade, the circus poster, circus music, and the circus tent. The first 3 chapters of this book alone are enough to give you a fairly thorough understanding of how the circus came to America, transformed, and then returned to Britain repackaged. I have only read about 5 chapters of this book so far, but I am loving it. The writing style varies from chapter to chapter because they're by different writers, but overall, I have found it quite accessible and entertaining. There are also many full-color images throughout that give much-needed examples of the topics discussed. The next book I want to show you is another one that seemed doomed to live out the rest of its days unopened on my coffee table because it is that beautiful, and that is The Circus, 1870s to 1950s, edited by Noel Daniel. And this book too is chock full of imagery. Daniel gathered about 300,000 images of the circus and then narrowed that down to the 600 images that are contained within this book. Most of the pictures in this book were published for the very first time in this publication. The book also has essays throughout to provide some context for the images, and although the book focuses on the American circus, both the text and the images give a brief overview of circus histories around the world as well. In fact, my version actually has French, English, and German translations already built into the text, which, besides having a bunch of images in there, explains why it is so chunky. I haven't read this book cover to cover yet, and I'm not even sure it's meant to be consumed that way. More likely, you would just want to open this book and get inspired and intrigued by all of the fascinating images in there, and slowly acquaint yourself with the look of the traditional American circus. This next one focuses on a single aspect of the circus, and that is its technological innovations. That is Circus, Science, and Technology, Dramatizing Innovation, edited by Anna Sophie Jurgens. This book, across all of the articles within, makes the argument that circus is a useful frame through which to understand our relationship to technology. And it thinks of technology and engineering in kind of a broad way, so there are chapters specifically dedicated to electricity or animation or how innovation in the circus apparatus affected circus athletics and aesthetics. But there is also a chapter on how P.T. Barnum engineered curiosity in the public. And Jane Goodall in this book tells us that he did this by breathing literal life into the museum space and exhibiting performers as curious, scientific, natural discoveries. Like, for instance, a disabled black man named William Henry Johnson. Johnson was advertised by Barnum in both racist and ableist ways, being called Zip the Pinhead and the Missing Link, or the What Is It? And Barnum provoked curiosity without putting himself in a vulnerable position by making false claims and appealing to pseudoscientists of the time to ensure his claims were academically sourced. So spectators could feel superior in their observation of Johnson because it was in the name of cultural and scientific education. Other books that I've discussed on this channel and in articles for Circus Talk, who I am partnering with to make this video, have discussed disability, gender, and race through the lens of the circus. However, I recently purchased a book that is entirely dedicated to racial diversity in the traditional circus, and that is Artistes of Color, Ethnic Diversity and Representation in the Victorian Circus by Steve Ward. As you're probably somewhat aware, the circus is sort of known as a place for outcasts and misfits and people on the fringes of society, and businessmen like Barnum profited off of this inclusion and diversity by reinforcing the otherness of Black and disabled performers. Despite the presence of circus performers of color in both the American and the British circus markets, Ward tells his reader that most of them have been glossed over in the history books because in the end, the circus was still, and I quote, a political vehicle that promulgated the idea of a British national supremacy. End quote. I am yet to read Ward's book, but he says he intends it to be a celebration of the many traditional circus performers from ethnic minority backgrounds, so I'm very excited to get to this one. You can pick it up from Modern Vaudeville Press if you too are interested. And the last one that I want to talk about covers another massive theme within the traditional circus that I'm sure you are aware of, and that is wild animal acts. So far I've only read the introduction of this book, but it feels like it's going to be the most academic on this list, and I am excited to read deeper, and that is Wild and Dangerous Performances, Animals, Emotions, Circus by Peta Tate. In this book, Tate writes that most studies of captured wild animals discuss zoos and menageries, despite the fact that a lot of animal rights organizations focus their activism around the circus. She suggests that this is because the role of animals in the circus is less ambiguous than it is at the zoo, where they can claim that they operate to offer sanctuary to endangered species, for instance. So this book specifically looks at trained big cat and elephant acts in the 20th century and how the animals were anthropomorphized to represent human-like emotions for the audience to interpret. Notably, from what I can tell after reading the introduction, this book doesn't just criticize circus for its treatment of animals, as other narratives of wild animals in the circus I have read do. Tate also celebrates the performance capacities of these animals and the fact that trainers in the circus recognized the individuality of wild animals before that was a mainstream concept. And perhaps that's what I find most interesting about studying American circus history, is that it resists easy answers. Difference was celebrated, but also exploited. It pioneered numerous art forms, but also business models. It was accessible, but also contributed to exclusionary practices. It was innovative, but also stagnant. It promoted and showcased modernization efforts that made our lives easier, but also harder as they contributed to the deterioration of our environment. What a rich and complex and contradictory case study of American culture that resists being cast in only a positive or a negative light. If you are interested to learn more about circus history, theory, news, contemporary shows you might want to go and see yourself, then I encourage you to head over to circustalk.com. There will be a link below to the article that I am publishing in tandem with this video, and I'm going to be partnering with Circus Talk for a couple more videos this year about different circus texts. If you're watching this and you're already involved in the circus, then you probably know a lot more about circus history than I do, so I encourage you to go and suggest me more texts to read in the comment section below. Otherwise, I will see you in another circus relevant video again soon. Bye everybody.